prominent Trump supporter and Tea Party activist named Scotty Nell Hughes went on CNN to discuss the possibility of a brokered convention. Let's watch.
All right, the word riots, he said it twice. That's pretty serious. A lot of us remember what happened in 1968 at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Wolf, I'm very proud. My grandfather was one of the organizers of the 1968 Democratic Convention, and one of those folks, and I guarantee right now if he was still alive, I think he'd be very proud of my involvement with Mr. Trump. But this, you have to understand the motivation of the riot here. It's not because people aren't getting their voices heard. It's because the people's voice would be ignored in this case. The majority, the plurality, the people, the majority of the population have voted for Mr. And the obvious moves that will be made by the establishment Republican Party to keep him from this nomination, that right there would cause anger. And that would be an obvious backhand to all of the people who have been paying attention and who have been engaged in this political process. So, you know, riots aren't necessarily a bad thing if it means it's because it's sitting there and fighting the fact that our establishment Republican Party has gone corrupt and decided to ignore the voice of the people and ignore the process.
Okay, so there are two separate conversations to have here, and on the two separate conversations, I come out on completely different sides for the various ones. So, for the first one, the idea of a brokered convention and what that would mean in the Republican Party, and if they were to steal this thing from Trump, on that one, I'm actually 100% with the Trump supporters. I think if he has a majority or a plurality of the delegates, he should be the nominee. I mean, he got the most votes. So if they're angry, now again, I despise Donald Trump. I think he's wrong about so many things, the overwhelming majority of things. The only time he's right is when I think he accidentally stumbles on some liberal talking points, which I would agree with. I don't even think he believes them, but sometimes he says them. But I would agree with Trump supporters if it got to the point where he had the most delegates, he had the majority or the plurality, but he didn't have the magic number, and they tried to take it from him. I would be 100% with the Trump supporters, because you have to think about it. What if it was your candidate and that was the situation you're in? You know, what if it was, say, Bernie Sanders, who had the most delegates but didn't get the required number, and then they try to do some tricky shit and put Biden or Hillary in there? We'd be like, that's absurd, and you guys are openly anti-democratic, the democratic will of the people. That's what it is. You could call it what you want. Just because you don't like Trump, that doesn't mean that's not what it is. That is what it is. So on that conversation, I'm actually 100% with her, and I'm 100% with Trump supporters. Now, the other conversation is what she slipped in there at the end. Riots aren't necessarily a bad thing. Riots aren't necessarily a bad thing. This is something where if/when a liberal says it, the cries of the cultural rot in society and the thuggishness that we deal with on the left, the hoodlums, riots aren't necessarily a bad thing. How dare you? Doing property damage and perhaps violence against people who had nothing to do with it. This is senseless. To get your point across, you have to do it in a peaceful and respectful way. Yeah, I actually think that's true, and I think it's true for both sides. But notice, whenever it's the Ferguson situation, where there were mostly peaceful protesters and some people rioted. The end of the world on the right. Read all the right-wing websites. Oh, my vicious hoodlums, thugs, disgusting, grotesque. These aren't real civilians. This is unbelievable. They're bad. They're all bad. But all of a sudden, when it's a riot for a cause they believe in, riots aren't necessarily a bad thing. It depends what you're rioting about. When I riot, it's good. If black people riot after an unarmed black person gets killed and murdered by a police officer, that's bad. Except the murder of the unarmed people. But when I'm upset about something, sure, I get to riot. You don't get to riot, I get to riot. You don't get to riot, I get to riot. Riots aren't necessarily a bad thing. When I do them, when you do them, bad, always bad. No. Look, I'm of the MLK variety on this, where I firmly believe that you can't defeat the devil by becoming the devil you're trying to avoid. So, if you're like, I hate the violence of the officers, so let's do violence in response. Well, no, that's a contradiction. Your violence is no better than their violence. Let's not do violence across the board. Yeah, I don't believe in fucking burning down people's buildings who have nothing to do with your beef. That only victimizes them, so that's not okay. So I'm against riots, and I'm against them across the board. I'm against them when they happen on the left, and usually, let's keep it real, the grievances on the left, I think, are much more legitimate. But I'm still against riots. And on the right, when most of their grievances are absolute bullshit, I'm against it when they do it too. But notice how quickly they flip the standard. All of a sudden, riots are fine when we do it and it's for our cause. When it's for your cause, it's not fine. No, let's be consistent here and let's be objective here and let's be clear and say I'm big time in favor of nonviolent civil disobedience. I'm fine. You can and should disrupt stuff, but you do it in a peaceful way because then you have the moral high ground. And notice how when it's something they care about, all of a sudden, riots? Maybe.